From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And good morning to you. Welcome to Sunday Edition. Over the last several days, Utah was hit quite hard with several inches of snow in the valleys and some feet up in the mountains. It's great news for Utah in general, but for Utah's ski resorts, it is amazing. Reporting, 68 inches of fresh snow just last week. But is it enough to pull Utah out of the 8-year drought? We'll be speaking with the state's Drought Coordinator Laura Haskell a little later on in the program. Plus, tonight marks the beginning of Hanukkah. And Rabbi Zippel will be joining me later in on the program to talk about the holiday and its celebrations and its traditions and celebrations, of course, happening not only around our state, but around the world. But first, the Respect for Marriage Act is now the law of the land. President Biden signed the legislation into law in a ceremony last week, which requires states to recognize same-sex and interracial marriages and guarantees federal benefits to those couples. And here to talk about the Respect for Marriage Act is Clifford Rosky, a professor of constitutional law at the University of Utah's S.J. Quinney College of Law. And Professor, welcome to the program. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's good to be with you.
How big a deal is this for our country?
It's really quite monumental. As you know, same-sex marriage was a major divisive political issue just a few years ago. And to see this Congress, which really struggles to reach a bipartisan agreement on any subject, agree on this issue and get a law passed it's a historic moment.
I honestly cannot remember anything in my lifetime, and I've observed politics and the news for a long time, but the way it just went along, and then it just went crazy. And I've never seen a major issue that, as you mentioned, was so divisive, kind of come together so quickly. I was back doing a broadcast for KSL Radio in June of 2015 when the decision came down, and we were broadcasting live, and wow, what I think has changed in that relatively short period of time. It's almost breathtaking.
Absolutely, and Utah's been a big part of that.
Let's talk about Utah's role. You and I were discussing this prior to going on the air, and actually a lot of what was done and discussed in Utah was almost a template for this.
And it occurred right before that decision in 2015. In about March of 2015, the legislature, the governor, Equality Utah, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and several other stakeholders came together and reached an agreement, not about marriage, but about prohibiting discrimination in the workplace and in housing against gay and transgender people. And that was a real milestone, and it was known as the Utah Compromise because there were protections for religious freedom as well as LGBT people.
I remember so much of this unfolded back when Bill Clinton was the president of the United States. I mean, we went from Don't Ask, Don't Tell to the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, and you look at where we are today, it is quite remarkable. Let's just talk about the absolute differences between the Defense of Marriage Act versus the Respect for Marriage Act.
They couldn't be more opposed. The Respect for Marriage Act repeals the Defense of Marriage Act specifically and says, whereas the Defense of Marriage Act said, well, for federal law, even if you're married in your home state, the federal government won't recognize it. And the Respect for Marriage Act says, if you're married in your home state, the federal government will recognize it, and other states have to recognize it too. So there's a huge difference there.
The interracial part of this, which is also in the Respect for Marriage Act, it's almost hard for me to believe now. And again, but this all happened during my lifetime, Loving v. Virginia and everything else. And why was it specifically kind of brought into this? A lot of people, at least I thought, well, that's kind of a done deal. Why is it included?
So the context for the Respect for Marriage Act is something that Justice Clarence Thomas said when the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade. He wrote a separate opinion calling upon the court to also overrule this 2015 decision, Obergefell, that legalized same-sex marriage. And more broadly, what the court did in that case was say, look, the word abortion isn't in the Constitution, so the Constitution doesn't protect abortion. And the word marriage isn't in the Constitution either. There are many rights that Americans hold sacred that are not in the Constitution explicitly. And so when Justice Thomas called upon the court to overrule more decisions, particularly decisions protecting the right to marry, I think across both parties, all across America, people said, we don't want you to do that. There's overwhelming support for same-sex marriage and certainly for interracial marriage now. And so it's really unusual to see Congress come together and rebuke the Supreme Court and say, don't you dare. But that's what happened here.
A lot of people have argued, even people within our delegation, that if Congress would be more aggressive about doing their job, then perhaps the executive branch wouldn't have to legislate through executive order, and the Supreme Court wouldn't have to legislate through some controversial decisions.
And in fact, conservative judges have long said, stop coming to court, go to the legislature. And here's an example where civil rights advocates went to Congress, the biggest legislature we have, and got a huge win.
We have just a second here. We've seen some major things. You mentioned Roe v. Wade. Boy, a lot of things I would have told you a couple of years ago. That genie's out of the bottle. It'll never go back in. Will this ever be challenged, what we're talking about today, the Respect for Marriage Act?
It's hard to imagine how someone could bring a constitutional challenge to this law. It basically says, the federal government is going to respect these marriages, and Congress has the right to control what the federal government does.
Right. Professor, thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights.
It's
a great holiday season here in the state of Utah. I hope you and yours have a great, great holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Holidays.
Let's take just a brief break here. We'll be back and we'll take a look at Utah's drought forecast. That and more coming up on Sunday Edition. Welcome back to Sunday Edition, and tonight begins the first night of Hanukkah for millions of people around the world. We pre-recorded this interview with Rabbi Avremi Zippel, and we're just delighted to have you here to talk about the 8-day Jewish holiday. And as a matter of fact, you brought along some props here, Rabbi. So
Hanukkah is a very visual holiday, so we thought we'd give you the benefit of seeing some of the fun things that we'll be celebrating over the next 8 days.
I have to admit, I'm getting a kick out of Hanukkah in a box.
It's a pretty packageable holiday. We try to keep things simple and light so people can grab some on the go, absolutely.
Let's talk about the history of this amazing holiday and something that dovetails in so beautifully into a season of joy and celebration.
Well, Hanukkah for us is about celebrating an event that took place thousands of years ago when the Jewish people were living in that land of Israel. They did not have control of their own land, and at some point they came under persecution, and as part of the persecution, the Holy Temple had been ransacked, desecrated, and what's unique about the story of Hanukkah, when looking at it in the tapestry of the wider holidays that we celebrate, is that there was no desire to harm a single Jew in a physical sense. There was no murders, there was no aggravated assault, there was no bloodshed. It was a war against faith. It was a war against religion. It was a war against the purity of the tradition. And the Jewish people were able to drive these forces from their land, and they were able to reclaim control of the temple. And upon going in there, they wanted nothing more than to rededicate the temple in its most authentic form. And one of the ways of doing so was by kindling the menorah, the candelabra that existed in the Holy Temple. And in order to do so, they needed to have a singular cruse of oil. Not just any oil would do. There had to be this cruse of oil that had the seal, the high priest, intact. And they looked far and wide, and they only found one small cruse of oil that in ordinary circumstances would have enough oil inside to burn for just one day. And it took about a week to procure more of this oil. And so with the faith in their heart, they lit that small amount of oil, and miraculously it burned for 8 days until more oil was able to be procured. And it's that commitment to authenticity, it's that commitment to faith and to tradition that we celebrate each and every year. The first night, tonight, we'll light one candle, the very first candle, and as the week goes along, we will add and increase and grow in that light till we've kindled the full menorah.
I was going to ask you about that. The menorah itself, You know, this is a very beautiful and somewhat stylized. I've seen some that really look old school. Is there any particular standard for the menorah?
I mean, I think these days people are getting more and more creative into how gaudy and incredible they can make a menorah. I saw earlier this morning the Lego store in Tel Aviv set the Guinness World Record for largest Lego menorah in the world. It's 14 feet tall or something like that. All a menorah needs is 8 branches of equal height and 1 of non-equal height. And so in this menorah, as it is with traditional menorahs, the shamash, the server candle right in the middle, is above the other branches. In some other ones, it's on the side. In others, it's lower than the other branches. And it's the 8 candles that are in a row that will light in ascending order, beginning on Sunday the 18th, ending on Sunday the 25th. And each night, in tandem with that candle that we light the server candle as well, which serves that purpose of allowing the other candles to be lit.
Along with the lighting of candles and the memory, of course, of the historic event, what are some of the celebratory things that families will do to make it an 8-day event?
I'll be honest with you, Doug, Hanukkah is not the holiday that your cardiologist is going to love. As we celebrate the miracle of the oil, there's a tradition of eating a tremendous amount of foods that are deep fried in oil. Chief on that list, you're going to have your latkes, your traditional potato pancakes, and your jelly donuts. And you eat enough of those for 8 days, and really it's a miracle that you make it through the entire holiday. But there's a lot of family time, there's a lot of public celebrations. Hanukkah is the one time of the year on the calendar where there's an emphasis placed on celebrating in the most public fashion possible, and so we'll be lighting menorah at the state capitol. We'll be lighting at Vivint Arena on Thursday night at halftime during the Jazz game. We'll be lighting the menorah each night at Abravanel Hall Plaza downtown. There's one up at the airport. There's a bunch all over town in front of our center and in other centers, and it's a very public and visible holiday.
Rabbi, what happens in the synagogue? Anything kind of formal?
As it's marked in the synagogue, it's marked with prayers of Thanksgiving. It's a time where we're grateful to God for the miracles that he performs, and it's a miraculous time of year for those that are in need of miracles and salvations in their own lives. It's a very auspicious time to pray for those things to happen in one's personal life, but it's specifically a public time as opposed to other times of years, the high holidays, where most of the observances are based in the synagogue. Over Hanukkah, we aim to be the center as much as possible and lighting menorahs in the streets and in public domains and bringing that idea of light to as broad an audience as possible.
For you personally, what is your favorite part of Hanukkah? What means the most to you?
When I think about the story and the narrative, as we talked about it just a few minutes ago, I think for me one of the most underrated parts of the story is we talked about the fact that there was a small amount of oil and they needed a much larger quantity, and yet they lit it. That first night they lit their candle, and they had no clue what would happen in the days to come. And by ordinary circumstances, it would have burned for one day and it would have gone out, and that would have been the end of the story. And yet they had faith in their hearts and they lit it. And I think for me, as I think about the takeaway messages of the holiday, I think at times, Nike talks about just doing it, and I think Hanukkah reminds us, just light it. Just light that candle, kindle that flame, and see where the rest takes you.
Sounds like there's a lot of faith involved.
I would say so. It's a very special time of year in that sense.
Rabbi Zippel, thank you so much. And we want to mention for our viewers that although they're watching this on Sunday morning, you and I recorded this much earlier. And I so appreciate you setting this aside of time for us. And a very happy Hanukkah to you.
Thank you, Doug. Happy Hanukkah to you and all of your viewers.
Thank you, and we'll be right back. Utah has seen a strong start to the snow season so far, with above average snow totals in November and in December. Now, is this going to be enough to really pull Utah out of what has been an 8-year drought? Laura Haskell is here with us, Drought Coordinator with the Utah Department of Natural Resources. Let's talk about the current situation. And that was my first question before we actually went on the air. So how are we doing?
We are doing a lot better than we have. If you look at the U.S. Drought Monitor map, they have, a month ago, we had 51% of the state in extreme drought, and now only 31% of the state is in that extreme drought. So a lot of improvement. I
mentioned that I had the pleasure on last Friday of driving up I-215 heading east and looking up at the Wasatch Mountains, and it's been a long time since I've seen it all white. From the very, very top, all the way down through the foothills, all the way down into the valley. It was gorgeous.
It is a beautiful sight to see all that snow and to have our snowpack in a good situation right now. I mean, we just hope that we can keep this up for the whole season.
I know there's just so much forecasting that can be done. As I've talked with our meteorologists here at KSL Radio and Television, they go, hey, we're pretty good for 10 days. We're not bad at 2 weeks. But when you start asking months out, is there any crystal ball images that you're able to put at least a little bit of confidence in as to what the rest of the winter might look like?
Well, the National Weather Service puts out a 3-month forecast, and they're kind of saying it might just be sort of an average year, not a lot wetter, not a lot drier. And I mean, considering the last years that we've had, average would be good.
Yeah, average would be good. At this point, we'd settle for average. You mentioned that 31% of the state, if I'm getting that number correct, still in extreme drought. Where is that?
It's in the middle of the state. Sevier Basin, that area has had a little bit harder time with their water supply. You know, they just haven't had water for several years, just trying to get their reservoirs full.
Is there any place in particular in the state? You know, I look at what we've been experiencing right here along the Wasatch Front, particularly in Salt Lake City and in Davis County and in Salt Lake County. Is there any place getting clobbered way above the average?
Every basin in the state is actually at 100% or better with their snowpacks. So
Wow.
That is great.
That is great. As far as the industries that are associated with snow, tourism primarily, skiing, of course, is huge. What are they looking at right now?
Well, Alta had 70 inches of snow this past week, so they're doing well. I heard from friends that skiing's great, and so a lot of good news there. They've had some years they've struggled for several years, so they deserved it.
What about our neighboring states? You know, we like to think of Salt Lake City as the crossroads of the West, kind of the epicenter of the Intermountain West, but how are they doing up in Idaho and in Wyoming and over in Colorado and, of course, you know, just across the border to the west in Nevada?
They're kind of where we are at, you know, struggling a little bit still, not as bad as it was, say, in 2020, but still just in this drought pattern that we're all kind of stuck in.
When I was asking you about forecasts and you mentioned 3 months, how accurate have they proven to be in the past when they're, you know, doing some really sophisticated guessworking here to go out 3 months? Can we kind of count on it?
They don't say, well, we're going to get this much snow or that much snow. They just say it's likely that we're going to get more, it's likely that we're going to get less, or it's likely that it'll be average. And so that's as detailed as they get. Nobody's
betting the farm on that, right? What about conservation? You know, that has been such a hot topic here in Utah now. It seems like forever when we talk about 8 years of fairly significant drought in our state. Such a focus on that in every aspect of our life. Are there conservation things that we should be doing even while we're kind of basking in this great snow?
Absolutely. You know, we do have a growing population, and so we need to all learn to just use less water all the time. There are toilet rebates that you can go. We replaced our toilet and got a rebate for that. Running a full load of laundry, running a full load of dishes, it will really save a lot of water.
Mm-hmm. Agriculture, you and I have talked about this before, here in the state of Utah, and I've heard everything from 70 to 80+% goes to agriculture itself. And everybody in polls, boy, they don't want to give up agriculture. Everybody has fond memories. Everybody wants to eat and have that kind of culture within our state. Are those that are engaged in agriculture, are they even ramping up for some fairly sophisticated conservation?
They are. Last legislative session, there was a lot of money awarded to helping optimize water use in the agricultural industry. And so there are grants available to help overcome those costs, because they are significant costs that need to be put in to make watering more efficient on farms.
As far as looking forward to spring, let's assume that we continue, maybe not on the super basis that we are right now, but it does become at least a good, solid water year average. What is that going to look like for Utah in the spring and in the summer?
Well, our reservoirs right now are about 12% lower than they would be this time of year. So we still need to make up a lot of water and things like vegetation. And we all know the Great Salt Lake's struggling. And so we need to just get some more water where it needs to be.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because the Great Salt Lake, I've discussed that with you, I've discussed it with Senator Romney, I've discussed it with so many people, just how imperative it is that we take care of the Great Salt Lake and we don't let the levels go drastically lower. I mean, that could be disastrous. So is it just keeping water in the streams?
Pretty much, yeah. They've done a lot with, the Division of Water Rights has done a lot with making sure that there's newer updated laws to keep that water going to the Great Salt Lake when they can. Right.
Let's talk about what municipalities, counties, entities, governmental entities are doing to encourage conservation. There are some that are talking about parking strips. There are some that are talking about the way we landscape our lawns, or our yards. How serious is that going to get? How tight will the regulations likely be? How many municipalities are working on that?
Right now, we are definitely encouraging it, but there aren't a lot of problems if they don't. There aren't a lot of consequences if they do that, because there's a lot of finances associated with that. But it'll become more and more, it'll just become more and more the norm.
I certainly appreciate you joining us today. And while you and I were chatting, all of a sudden we have another co-host with us. But Laura, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a very, very happy holiday season.
Thank you.
And here's to a great water year, right?
Yes.
It's funny, this became a little bit of a tradition, kind of by mistake on Sunday Edition, back a few years ago when my daughter-in-law was touring the station and happened to have my brand new grandson, and then we were doing the show from my home during the pandemic, and we had my first granddaughter who joined us at the tail end of that show to wish everybody a happy new year and a happy holiday season. And this is Luna. She's the latest addition to our family. She's 10 months old, and we're so glad to have her. And Luna, can you smile? Can you smile? Look, can you smile? There we go. There's a little bit of a smile. But from here, let's try it one more time. You're fascinated by, there we go, there we go. But from all of us here on Sunday Edition, including Luna, we wish you a very, very happy holiday season for the next few weeks. We'll kind of be on hold for Christmas weekend and for New Year's weekend, but have a great, great Christmas, happy holiday season, and a happy new year from all of us here at KSL and on Sunday Edition, and from Luna. Huh? Yeah.